Hello, I'm Michael, the manager of the Dead Ink Bookshop. A couple of days ago, we were scheduled to have a live streamed conversation between Dr. Sophie Oliver and Alex Bollen, author of a new book called Motherdom. Sadly, we had to abandon that plan due to various technical challenges, but we did record a conversation between Sophie and Alex, so I'm very happy to say that's what we're sharing on today's episode, with apologies to anyone who was disappointed the other day. Hopefully, this will make up for it. So, Motherdom, Breaking Free from Bad Science and Good Mother Myths by Alex Bollen, proposes a new conception of motherhood which values and respects the different ways that people raise their children to counteract the good mother myths that are used to criticise, blame, and censure mothers, myths which are built out of stereotypes, exaggerated narratives in the media, and plain old bad science. Alex is a researcher with 20 years' experience, as well as a writer, NCT, postnatal practitioner, history graduate, and trained solicitor, and says that writing this book drew on all of her experience. It's a meticulously researched piece of work that aims to shift the focus of the conversation onto what resources and relationships children really need to flourish. The book is out now, and today Alex is talking to Dr. Sophie Oliver of the University of Liverpool. Sophie is an interdisciplinary scholar, curator, and writer specialising in modernist women, writers, and artists, fashion, the feminist avant-garde, and feminist approaches to cultural history. So, with no further ado, over to Sophie and Alex.
First of all, I'm so happy to be in conversation with you, Alex Bollen. We're here to talk about your wonderful new book from Verso. And given that I'm speaking to you from Liverpool, I'll also tell everybody listening that it's available to buy. If you want to buy a physical copy, it's available to buy in the Dead Ink Bookshop on Smith Down Road, and Dead Ink are hosting this conversation. So thanks so much to them. I'm here as a lecturer at the University of Liverpool, someone who thinks a lot about feminism, and I think it is a feminist book. But I'm also here, I suppose, as a mother. My daughter was 10 last week, so as I've been reading this book, I've been thinking a lot about the last 10 years, and especially the kind of early years. And I was thinking specifically, we're going to talk about good mother myths, which is, what so much of your book is about. And I was thinking specifically about a moment in the first year of my daughter's life when I was really introduced, before I knew this term that you've used here, to this idea of these myths and how they kind of control us as new mothers. I went to the doctor and was diagnosed with postnatal depression. I was very sick actually after my daughter was born, and the doctor, who was otherwise a very caring, lovely woman who's very supportive, said that it was really important that I got on top of this because this period of my daughter's life was so important for attachment, that this bond with her was incredibly important for her development. And I think she probably said brain development, which I'm sure is going to be something that we get into. And reading your book and the things, that you hope you're going to talk about with me now, so people will understand why it was so powerful to read that and kind of reflect back on that moment, actually, as a very kind of, important moment. 10 years on, I can still remember it, in vivid detail, but a kind of casual moment with a caregiver, with a doctor, where a good mother myth was being kind of used to get me to behave in a certain way, to get me to think about my child in a certain way, to take medication, all things that, in the end were good for me. But something about this action, which was good for me, also kind of led me to feel very guilty and full of shame. And I think one of the things I loved about this book is that it's not trying to necessarily give more advice. Actually, it's trying to kind of cut through some of this kind of advice, some of these sorts of ideas that are given to women in lots of ways by doctors, by advice books, but they kind of come from all different angles. So I suppose that's kind of, a personal anecdote to ground my response to the book. I wonder, just to get us started, how you could say a little bit about your personal connection to the subject. How did you come to write this book?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sophie. And it's lovely to be speaking to you. And I'm really sorry to hear about that experience. And it's exactly because of so many women have had experiences like that. It has been a real driver for me in writing this book. It has its roots in my own motherhood. I had a really difficult start to motherhood, and I really felt like I was failing in all sorts of ways. And I read a book when my son was about 6 weeks old, which was all about sort of babies' brains. And it really made me feel like I was letting him down. I was sort of worried about sort of dark holes growing in his brain. I actually had nightmares about bits of his head missing. And it had a profound effect on me. And I was lucky. I had a sort of supportive network around me of friends and family. My baby became more responsive. Things just felt like they were getting a bit easier. And I kind of pulled myself out of that sort of deep pit that I felt I was falling down into, having read this book. So brain claims for me, right from the start of motherhood, have been an issue. And something which I really wanted to explore, because it's kind of like, hang on a sec, is this stuff actually right? I'm a researcher, so I spent many years at Mori, then Ipsos Mori, and I still do lots of sort of freelancing work for them. And so I wanted to understand the research behind some of these claims. The other thing I did was I trained as a postnatal practitioner with the NCT, so ran lots of groups for new mothers in Southwest London, and which is where I live. And that has been a really sort of profoundly lovely experience. It's taught me a lot about early motherhood, but I was still saying, why are women so hard on themselves? People say, oh, I feel really guilty because I've had a shower. And it's kind of like, why are you feeling guilty about having a shower? And it's trying to unpick that. So I was trying to unpick, why do women not value their mothering? And why women given such a hard time about their mothering. So it is very much a feminist book. And I think that this concept of good mother myths helps explain it, because it is about control and prescribing behavior. Good mother myths are also used as an alibi, as excuses for letting down children and families. The brain claims are quite interesting, because the brain claims didn't come from scientists. They came from advocacy groups in the States in the 1990s. And lots of the people who've written about how you need to sort of stimulate your children and, talk to your babies in a certain way. And if you don't, their brains won't be wired properly. The people writing this stuff are, not neuroscientists. They're sort of psychiatrists or psychologists. And it's a real sort of fundamental sort of misapplication of science. So I wanted to really kind of get under the bonnet of that. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized how flimsy lots of these prescriptions are. And I was just really cross about it. I was really angry. And I thought, this is not okay, because it's making individual women feel miserable. And it means we're looking in the wrong places to make things better for children and families.
I love that phrase, getting under the bonnet, and I think we will get more under the bonnet of some of these issues, which, as you say, have really long-lasting effects, I think, on families, on the way that people parent or feel about their parenting, at least, and different effects on different people, actually. I wonder if we can ground this a bit, first of all, in thinking, what are some of these myths? You talk about the way that some of them are very specific, some of them are very broad. Can you give us some examples of some of the kind of common good mother myths?
Yeah, I think the both the broadest and the most enduring good mother myth is the self-sacrificing, nurturing mother, the mother who will do anything for her children, and happily. So she has her fulfillment, her contentment, her happiness comes from bringing up her babies, bringing up her children, and there's nothing she wouldn't do. That one's been with us for a long, long time. And I mean, going back to what you were saying about your experience, it's not, you're not allowed to say, hey, Sophie, you're a person, you deserve to be well. Here's how we can sort of help you through this really difficult period. It has to be framed in terms of your daughter. And it's this idea that women sort of naturally are selfless, naturally are self-sacrificing. And so firstly, it's a way of criticizing women and denying them the opportunity to look after their needs. And secondly, it kind of creates a lot of internal guilt and shame as well. Like, so I'm so selfish. Why am I caring about this? Or why do I really want to go back to work or spend time with my friends or read a book or any of the sort of many other things that you might want to do? And I think, and that myth can be really used in very damaging ways. So if you look in the States, and there's been a sort of backlash against reproductive rights, and just huge amounts of cruelty to women, and women's lives being put at risk, women actually dying because anything can be sacrificed in the name of the unborn baby. So that's the broadest, the most pernicious, the most enduring, I would say. Then we have some very sort of, as you said, some very specific good mother myths, which are quite specific to sort of time and place. So say 100 or so years ago, it was all about strict routines, and you need to feed your baby sort of every 4 hours, and you need to make sure they're going to the toilet regularly, because this is the way in which you build good character. And this was all sort of tied into sort of nation building and ideas of race, links to eugenics. And the advice which was given then, if you sort of gave that advice now in terms of you'll ruin your baby if you don't feed them regularly, you'll ruin your baby if they're not sort of toilet trained by, when they're a few months old, etc. If you said that now, everyone would think, blimey, the advice is very different. But we're still talking about human babies and human beings. Now the advice is about sort of stimulating babies. You must constantly be stimulating them, but doing so consciously. So there's all these good mother myths about you can turn ordinary moments into brain building moments. So the idea, you take your baby to the shop, or you give your child a bath, you must consciously be thinking, oh, I'm going to make this brain building. It's not enough just to be spending time doing things with caring for our children. The good mother is consciously sort of optimizing her children. And this idea of optimization is a very prevalent and powerful good mother myth that we have to live with now. And it's this idea we need to optimize our children. We need to make them the best they can be. We need to give them the best care. And there are many, many things which are wrong with that. One of them is this idea that there is a best way to care for children. And there really isn't. There's so much diversity in us as humans, in our children, so many different ways in which we can, nurture and comfort and protect and love our children. And this idea that we have to sort of follow this rigid recipe is a good mother myth, which is just so disrespectful of the different ways in which women and other caregivers nurture and protect and love children.
Disrespectful, yes, and other things too that you go into in the book in terms of the implications of these good mother myths. We've used this word before, kind of a controlling aspect to it, isn't there? Can you talk to us a little bit about the implications of these good mother myths? How do they operate? What do they do?
I think good mother myths they tend to be sort of fashioned by the experts of an era. And, I've said a little bit about where all these kind of brain claims and building children's brains come from. So they're sort of fashioned by experts, but then they're exploited by lots of other different actors, often politicians. And in the UK, for the last sort of 20 or so years, this idea of building secure attachments and making sure children's brains are appropriately wired has been very much the orthodoxy, and I think has been used to kind of distract attention away from things like poverty, for instance, which we know is really bad for children. On an individual level, in terms of how they work with mothers, it's the threat of harm to your children. It's, if you don't do this, then your baby will have a badly wired brain. If you're not responsive to your children, then they're going to grow up to be screwed up. So good mother myths work and have their power because we're told that if we don't do this or we don't do that, we're going to mess our children up. And that's one of the reasons why they're so powerful. They trade on our love for our children. And that's one thing which makes me really frustrated and angry as well. The other really sort of powerful enforcement mechanism for good mother myths is something I've talked about called unmothering, which is a phenomenon identified by Black feminist scholars in the US about women being denied their motherhood altogether by having their children taken away. And so many studies, conversations about motherhood you scratch the surface, and that's people's fear. I'm going to have my child or my children taken away from me. And that's very powerful sort of form of compliance in terms of how people behave and feel. A lot of these good mother myths aren't just about what women do, it's about how they should be feeling. And if you're not happy and delighted and fulfilled, then there's something wrong with you, and you must be depressed, and then have some tablets. So mothering is a fear of mothers in general, but it hits marginalized women much more strongly as a reality. And I think both in the UK and the US, poverty, race, marginalized women are more likely to have their children taken away. And I've written about this a bit in the book, about if we sort of go back to the last century, sort of having children out of wedlock was socially unacceptable, and women who got pregnant were punished by having their babies taken away. And the sort of forced adoption scandals that we saw in the UK, the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Ireland. And that's really clear. We can see that much more clearly about, that happened, that caused lifelong pain for those mothers and for those children. But our mothering is still happening. It's just invisible to us. But the fear of it, I think, afflicts all mothers potentially as well.
And so this idea of the good mother and these myths are kind of a tool of these sorts of other kind of broader projects, as it were.
Yeah.
And they're kind of legislating, aren't they, or creating these values about like who's fit to be a mother, who's not fit, which are very old ideas, of course, and go back, as you were saying earlier, to kind of eugenicist thought from the late 19th, early 20th century. They create ideas about kind of, as you say, kind of what's normal, what's optimal. And in fact, just the fact that mothers experience these good mother myths very differently, as you're saying, in that they're kind of affecting marginalized women in very particular ways. And actually just the fact that these myths have changed over time shows that this is all actually very context specific. It kind of, what you do so brilliantly in the book, I think, is show that they're just what you say they are. They're myths, they're ideas, and they come from particular places, out of particular, political regimes. They are ideologies, aren't they? As you say at one point, that they're not based in kind of anything fixed or consistently true. Of course, that gives us hope that they can be changed too.
Definitely, sure, and I think we do have to have that optimism
later on. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think one other mechanism which we haven't touched upon yet, which is quite an important theme of the book, and I think from my experience anyway, quite an important part of people's experiences of mothering, how they feel about mothering, is this idea of nature and what's natural. And so we're told this is natural. So again, feeling fulfilled, feeling happy when you're with the children, we're told that that's natural. And so by definition, if you don't feel like that, then you're unnatural. And this idea of sort of the unnatural mother, I've written about in the book, sort of creates the sense of moral outrage. And so if you're an unnatural mother, you can be punished for that. And so some of the venom and the anger and the vitriol that we see directed towards women, I think that is partly explained by this idea that they are deemed to be unnatural, therefore worthy of venom and anger and punishment. One feminist philosopher who's really strongly influenced me is Kate Manne, whose Down Girl book looks at the sort of mechanics of misogyny. And it's a brilliant book. I'd thoroughly recommend it. And she talks about how women are deemed to be givers. We give reproductive labor, sexual labor, domestic labor, social labor, and men are entitled to be takers. And a real light bulb went off in my head when I read that book, and I thought that's exactly what's happening as well with mothers. And actually that mother role is deemed to be a kind of giver role. And so if women aren't giving in some way, then that's unacceptable. So that
they're
was
not engaging with their baby, if they're not looking in their eyes, if they're not responding to their needs all the time, kind of immediately, if they're not sacrificing things, as you said, that's all unnatural. That's kind of, so therefore it's grounds for punishment, as you're saying.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the reasons, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why breastfeeding is such a fraught issue, but one of them is this contradiction between women are supposed to give to their babies, but also give to men. This idea that, you know, breast having a dual function just seems to be something our culture just can't cope with at all. And I mean, sort of my experience of working with new mothers, breastfeeding is one of the things which just causes the most kind of upset and distress, you know, during the early days. And even if, you know, even women who just like, I definitely don't want to breastfeed, you know, are still given a hard time. And I think that says a lot about our very, you know, our misogynistic and messed up culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally that, you know, this idea of misogyny in kind of tandem, I suppose, with classism and racism, is about kind of, it's sort of, I think you used the term at one point about reproducing inequalities, that, you know, as you know, women ostensibly have more kind of power and privileges in society. It seems as if we've gone, you know, mothering is one of the ways in which those freedoms are being limited, and very particular, you know, really limited for particular groups of women. So there's this kind of insidiousness about it, I think, you know, that this, and as you say, this period in someone's life that's supposed to be kind of characterized by kind of love as well as adventure and ambivalence, which I'm sure we'll come to, you know, is being kind of used in a way to also kind of coerce women into particular kinds of behavior, all the while, as you say, ignoring the things that actually have been proven to have a real effect on children's development, like poverty.
Yeah.
This is very individual way of thinking about parenting, isn't it? You know, that it's not just parents, it's the mothers who are responsible, and they bear this huge burden on their shoulders of their child's development. And that's a very convenient way of looking at things if you're a government who isn't going to redirect money, for instance, into you know, schemes that are going to you know, help young families, or, you know, bring more children out of poverty, for example. Tell us a bit more then about the science aspect, because there are these kind of these ideas that are really important in the book about good mothers and why they're wrong. But one of the most powerful things I think that you do in the book is not just say that these ideas are ideas, they're myths and they're wrong. You actually kind of get quite technical with some of the science that's been used. And this is something that's obviously come from, you know, your background as a researcher, and, you know, and really kind of looking at data and assessing whether this is the kind of data that should be being used to tell women these things that we've been discussing. So tell us a bit more about the science and how it's been used to promote these myths.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. I mean, I'm really interested in the mechanics of how all this works and how science is misused. And I was really conscious that I didn't want to write a really sort of highly sort of technical book that most people go, oh, this is just a bit too much. But I did also want to sort of show my workings, if that makes any sense. And I mean, I was generally quite shocked when I started looking at these studies, given the training I'd had in research, at how flimsy some of them were. So I was trained that you need to have a decent sample size. In other words, sort of speak to enough people so you know that your findings, you found something real rather than just sort of random. Who you speak to is important. So is the group of people that you're including in your research really reflective of sort of broader society, or is it a very specific group? What sort of conclusions are you drawing? So I sort of write about this quite a bit, about how correlation isn't causation. Just because two things are linked, it doesn't mean that one thing causes the other. And I think what happens so much in any kind of research about sort of mothers and children is anything related to the children is just automatically linked back to the mothers in some ways. And it's kind of like, well, might it not be the way around? Aren't there other things going on? And so these very sort of deep baked assumptions about mothers impacting their children's futures are just in these studies without even being kind of considered. That was the thing which really surprised me. You know, science isn't objective. science is subjective. We all have biases, and it's kind of understanding what are our biases, what are we bringing to this study. And there are just so many blind spots when it comes to research, which looks at sort of mothers and children. And I think any study that kind of validates sort of deep held cultural beliefs just gets, it's more likely to be accepted. So one of the things I've written about in the book is what's called bonding research, which was some research done in the 1970s, which showed that I think it's like 24 babies, and half of the babies were taken away from their mothers after birth, which was the norm in American hospitals at the time, and the other half spent time with their mothers. And then they sort of tracked these babies up until about the age of 5 and showed differences between them, which were attributed to those first few hours after birth, which is kind of on the face of it pretty ridiculous that, like 2 or 3 hours after birth would make a difference to someone, what a child is like at the age of 5. But because our belief in sort of maternal power is so strong, people were willing to accept that. And it was only when these studies were subjected to some really powerful critiques and they weren't replicated that the researchers sort of finally rode back. But I just think the fact that that was even accepted as truth, and there were sort of books written about it, and it just goes to show how willing we are to accept scientific findings which confirm our beliefs and prejudices.
I think it's important to be clear that, I mean, you're a social scientist, you're trained in social science methods, and you're not saying that science doesn't have a place in thinking about motherhood at all. You're saying that these are very powerful ideas that have very powerful implications, and therefore there should be higher standards, I suppose, in terms of the science that's used, to give advice, to inform policy. You talk about the way that some of these, and this is very common, I'm sure, but you talk about the way that lots of these studies use animals, humans. As you said, the sample sizes are too small, that some of the findings are massaged, by policy groups or university press offices, this goes back to this idea that science isn't objective, I suppose, in that it also is used in particular ways, to stress the originality of the research, to stress the achievements of the researchers. This is a very normal thing that happens. It's, these people aren't doing anything particularly unusual, but you're taking them to task, I suppose, on that, saying, hang on a minute, this is going under the bonnet, and really seeing actually what's how certain, how stable are these findings, if we're going to base something as important as how mothers are represented in society and how they're advised. I wonder whether you could tell us a bit maybe about the brain claims,
and
some of the way that science has been used in this slightly kind of shoddy way, I suppose, or misused, and what the effects of that have been.
Really happy to talk about that, but just very quickly, just to say on science, I'm absolutely not sort of anti-science. I'm sort of just anti-science done shoddily, and I think the relationship between sort of scientific findings and policy prescriptions is a really interesting one. And I understand why policymakers want to have certainty, and science just quite often doesn't provide it. So it's difficult, and I think all the things you've said I completely agree with about why it's difficult. But there is this gap between what we learn from scientific studies and how we can apply them. And I think nowhere is that more true than when it comes to brain claims. Our knowledge of the brain, it's increasing, it's improving, but there is still so much we don't know. And the idea that we can say babies' brains are built, and the brain, it's like a house. I mean, this is one of the metaphors that we hear a lot, and this metaphor of building really does pervade advice at the moment. We just really don't know enough about how brains develop. What's the relationship between genetics, input, how much of brain development is just down to random chance, that brain is going to develop in that way. We've just got huge sort of chasms of knowledge about it. But the way in which brain claims are shared with parents, that it's done in a really sort of certain way, like and this idea of optimization, the more you do this, the better it is for your child's brain development, is a really classic one. And that one particularly annoys me because it's illogical. There's no such, you can't say the more the better, because there is a ceiling to brain development. You're not going to have like a child with a super brain because you spent every hour of the day stimulating them. So I think with the brain claims, that's where there is the sort of the biggest gap between what we know about the science of brains and what parents are being told. And what's quite interesting about it is a lot of these papers were written sort of 20 or so years ago, and they're still in circulation, and they've not really been updated, which is extraordinary because so much research has been done around the human brain in the past 2 decades, and we have learnt a lot more. And a lot of what we're learning is how plastic the human brain is. And there's been some really interesting work around how mothers and fathers' brains change and develop after they've had children. So Lucy Jones has written about this in Matrescence, for example. But although we need to build our children's brain stuff, it's almost sort of set an aspect from things which were written 20 years ago, and that hasn't been updated because the way in which the scientific field has developed just doesn't support any of that. So it's a really good example, I think, of just a huge gulf between sort of scientific knowledge and policy and parenting prescriptions. And it's all down to, cultural expectations of mothers. So basically the brain claims very much build on attachment theory, John Bowlby's attachment theory, which was developed in the 1950s and 60s, which is all about the responsive mother who's always interacting, always responding to every cue. So it's kind of giving a sort of neuroscientific mantle to what we've been told for decades in attachment research.
It's very interesting, that section on Bowlby, and his assumptions too about what a good family should be like, that it was very much based in a kind of patrician idea of a kind of heterosexual family, and very kind of conservative ideas about women, and we've moved past those ideas so far, and yet the residue of that is still there, isn't it, in the way that mothers are expected to be these kind of consistent, good, nurturing, natural figures. So there's this kind of glacial pace, I suppose, that you're talking about things kind of not shifting far enough, but you're also warning against kind of moving too fast before we know more about this neuroscience that's been used to prop up some of these claims. But they're there when we're told, when I was told as a young mother, that this kind of this period in my daughter's life was the most important because that was when her brain was developing. That was the implication of what I was told, I think. And that's a terrible thing to walk around with, actually. Really, I think who knows how what fed into to my illness in that period, but it definitely didn't help me feel better. Let's say that to feel that kind of responsibility. It made me think so much about what I was missing. How an alternative, how I could have been thinking about that, actually. And one of the nice things about having, read your book over the last few weeks is kind of using that new information, that new knowledge in all of my everyday encounters, actually, with my daughter, and, sort of shifting that guilt and that sense of responsibility away. And if I say no to her, that I don't want to do something, I particularly appreciated the section when you say that not everyone has to enjoy playing with children, and some days if you don't feel like it, that's okay. For all the book's kind of frustrations and in a sense of kind of anger, it ends and has within it, actually, throughout, a sense of kind of hope, and optimism about an alternative. I suppose the alternative is implicit in everything you've been saying now, but it would be lovely to hear you talk a bit more about what that is. And I suppose that's Motherdom, which is the title of the book. Tell us what Motherdom is, and why it's this better alternative of thinking about mothering.
So the last chapter is called Embracing Motherdom, and I've sort of write about what I think it's not just what motherdom is, but also what motherdom could be. So the suffix dom, I mean, Sophie, you're an English academic, so I almost feel slightly embarrassed explaining to you. But
I'm not
for our lovely audience,
I'm not on the linguistic side, so you can say anything to me and I won't know.
But yeah, for our lovely audience, the dom is means condition, state, realm, and it's attached to lots of words like freedom, martyrdom. And I think freedom is a really good example, because freedom is you can use it to describe your current state, but you can also use it in an aspirational way. This is how we would like like to be. And I think motherdom has that sort of double meaning. So it is about recognizing the dignity and the condition of mothers, but it is also hoping for a better society for mothers and children. And so in the last chapter, I sort of talk about what that means. I mean, I think for me, a really important part of motherdom is about just having a much more generous and expansive vision of motherhood. So expansive in the sense of there are many, many different ways in which women care for and protect and love their children. And I give some examples, in the book, from teaching children how to cross the road safely to sort of schooling them in police violence. And all these everyday acts that we do for our children, I think are really important, and we should recognise and value them. And that's part of the generosity of motherdom as well, is appreciating everything that women do for their children, because we have this deficit model at the moment. It's like, oh, you haven't done this, you haven't home cooked a meal, you didn't read to them at bedtime. It's all the things that we're not doing enough. And it's saying, hey, let's just flip this around and look at all the things which women do for their children. And I think particularly women who are mothering in difficult circumstances, poverty, polluted neighborhoods, poor housing, violent partners, there are so many things which make bringing children up challenging. And I think women mothering in those circumstances just deserve particular appreciation. And as I've said in the book, that's no substitute for proper support, but it's almost like we've got it the wrong way round. The women whose mothering is the most difficult because of the situations they live in are the ones subjected to the most blame and censure, and that just feels to me completely the wrong way around. Motherdom's also for me about kind of celebrating diversity as well, different family setups, different ways of bringing up children. We're all of us, we're so the product of our own individual upbringings, but also our society, the culture we live in, our relationships, our support systems, our values, all of these shape how we mother, and that's completely fine. Some of the sort of debates that people have about whether or not you should have a routine or not, I couldn't care less whether or not someone's got a routine or not got a routine for their baby. It's kind of what works for you, and this idea that if you've got a routine and I haven't, it means I'm a bad mother, or vice versa. I really want us to kind of move on from all of that. For me, part of motherdom is about that kind of understanding and supporting each other as mothers, and understanding and appreciating that we are going to do it differently, because we're different people in different contexts and situations, and that's fine. There's a really real political element to it as well, from everything we've been talking about, and it's that mothers can't do it alone, and children deserve to have a good start in life. One of the things which makes me furious about the brain claims is it's just so irrelevant when we have, we know the children, we're the 6th largest economy in the world, and we have children going to bed hungry. And that's just completely unacceptable. So children should have good housing, they should feel safe, they shouldn't be having to breathe polluted air, they should have enough to eat. Parents should have secure jobs which are well paid. we should have public spaces, not just for families, but for everyone to enjoy. One of the questions I've been asked quite a lot whilst I've been giving talks about my book is how are things different to when you first had your children? My eldest is nearly 20. And I've said a lot of the kind of public spaces I used to go to as a new mum, like you'd go to rhyme time at the library or you'd go to a children's centre, they're just not there anymore. You know, so much has been taken away from families. So there's a huge sort of societal piece around it as well. I also think, you know, I've mentioned, you know, reproductive justice. I think that, you know, the book's been published in the US as well. I think that's so important. I think anyone who cares about children needs to care about reproductive justice, maternity services, postnatal services, you know, the start of parenthood. We are letting people down so badly in this country right now. I mean, nearly half of maternity units in England aren't safe. So I think there's a huge societal element to motherdom as well. So it's appreciating mothers, but it's not expecting mothers to do it all alone. And Alison Gopnik, who's a wonderful development psychologist, I really recommend her books, but she talks about children don't need to be taught how to play. They need to be given a sort of nurturing garden that allows them to grow and explore. And I think that nurturing the garden is the responsibility of all of us, of all of society.
Thank you. That's such a enabling answer, I think, in some ways, as well as the kind of the difficult things for us to think about how that will change in terms of these societal things. I think you are in that generosity kind of making space for people to be kinder to themselves as parents, you know, to see what they're doing in everyday activity. You talk about ordinary loving care, and you know, that's an empowering thing to think about. I think even in the face of, you know, more complex structural issues. What's next, Alex? Are you working on another book after, you know, such a diverse career and now writing this fantastic book, which just, you know, cuts through the issues and feels kind of necessary for all the reasons you just talked about? Do you have another project that you're working on?
Well, thank you for what you said about the book, Sophie. I really appreciate that. I do have another manuscript because I originally started off as a really bulky book about sort of early motherhood, and I ended up sort of hiving off all the very specific stuff around sort of sleeping and crying and routine. So I've still got all those chapters. So I'm going to go back and have a look at those because I feel like there is a need for something very specifically aimed at new parents, because I think there's so much moralizing around sleeping, for instance, and routines, and I would really like to write something which kind of cuts through that and just sort of empowers people to find what works for them, and make the choices that they make, and also that they're babies. I mean, part of the issue with good mother myths is they deny the agency of our children, because I think, you know, our children have got a lot to say about how they're going to grow and develop as well. So I think, you know, so that's potentially next, but I definitely want to stay writing, you know, about feminist issues. I'm really interested in history. So yeah, so I think I look at the early motherhood thing, and then I want to carry on exploring all those other issues as well.
Amazing. I look forward to it. Thanks so much for talking to me, Alex. I really love the book, enjoyed our conversation so much. And just a reminder for people listening in Liverpool that you can go and buy a copy. It's beautifully stacked in the background of Alex's video that I can see. And it's just a great read for all the technical stuff too. You know, it's very, very readable. And you will feel, like Alex says, I think, angry, but also hopeful.
Thank you, Sophie. And thank you, Dead Ink Books as well. I really appreciate having this platform. Thank you.
Okay.
Cool.
Great.
Oh, thank you, Sophie. I really enjoyed that.
We were pros in the end.
I had a feeling
it's horrible the way that the tech stuff just makes you feel like, you know, like you're not like you're a child or something, can't do things, you know.
And I have to like you say, we've been doing it long enough, all this tech stuff that
anyway, I think that's what they hoped, that you know, that it would be a kind of, there would be a lasting sort of thing that can be used for social media and, you know, putting it out there. And so I think this is done its job.
So what are you working on at the moment, Sophie?
I'm just finishing a book that is it's called A Women's History of Modernism, is the subtitle. I do quite a lot of work on fashion and clothes. So it's every chapter is a different artist or writer, and every chapter is their story of their life and work is told through an item of clothing.
Oh,
so it's kind of history, intellectual history, and yeah, kind of literary studies and biography and life writing, I guess, as well. And I've been working on it for longer than my daughter is old. So I will be really, that's another thing that I was thinking about last week. You know, she's 10 and I've been working on this book since before she was born. So I shall be very glad. My deadline is the 1st of July and I'm on research leave at the moment. So I should just be so glad to finish it.
Well, my book took 10 years of
Oh, it did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that sounds really interesting. Well, Sophie, look, if there's anything I can do to sort of help when it comes to publication, do stay in touch, because it sounds super, super interesting.
Thank you.
And right up my street, actually, in terms of like sort of, you know, well, I can't claim to be a fashionista, but you know, sort of writing women, history, feminism, you know, it sounds really, really interesting. So if there's anything I can do to help at all,
thank you so much.
when it comes to
Yeah,
publication, you know, just please give me a shout, because I'd be, yeah, really happy to support you in any way I can.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. Thanks. Yeah. Well, good luck. You must be very busy doing everything you can for getting the book out there. And is it already out? Has it already been published?
Yeah, it's out. It's out. Yeah, yeah. So it's been
thrilling.
It's kind of a bit like having a baby, having your first book published. I mean, really, it's just like, obviously there's lots of reasons why it isn't, but it has been really amazing, but it's been quite like woof as well.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, it'll be, well, enjoy it, and then it'll be nice when it dies down and you can kind of have some quiet thinking time again.
No, but it's been brilliant. But Sophie, thank you so much for, you know, your time today. I really appreciate it.
I enjoyed it. It was lovely.
Really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope to get Dead Ink Books, Michael. I hope to get to Liverpool and come, because the thing I really loved about Instagram books is just that, and things like Dead Ink, that they've had these gorgeous pictures, like the sun streaming into their shop. Books. I'm just like, oh, I must go.
It is a really lovely shop, actually. It's very nice. It's very near where I live too, so I'm often there. But yeah, they're doing good things and really care. Sorry, fire alarm. They really care about books and authors, and you know, independent bookstores are so important for that, aren't they? So yeah.
Oh, well, lovely to speak to you. Good luck with the writing.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Nothing like a
Bye,
deadline.
Alex. Lovely to meet you. Bye.